So welcome back, everybody. We are back from our midterm, and I hope you all survived. I'm sure everybody did. We're going to talk a little bit about the business environment for a corporate investigator. And it's something that if you ignore, your investigations will go sideways very quickly. You have to understand that workplaces are hierarchies. They are environments. They are populations in their own right. They have their own rules and their own set of standards that you need to think about as a corporate investigator. Otherwise, you could get tripped up. So let's just jump right into, and one more thing about this unit, it's really applicable across anything that you do. Most corporate investigators just don't just take it for granted and try to work in the environment and don't try to analyze it a little bit before they get started. But in any type of job that you get into, this information is of some value. So no matter whether you end up as a security manager or a cybersecurity specialist or a safety specialist or go into business, this is something that can definitely be helpful across the spectrum. So just enjoy the unit as a general refresher, and then we'll tie it all together with how this impacts the corporate investigator. So why is this all important? Well, just as we talked about our corporate investigator mindset, right? That business-like, very structured mindset that you have, as opposed to some of the police examples we've talked about, which are correct in their environment. This is correct in ours. You have to adapt to the political realities of the workplace. Otherwise, you just won't succeed. They're hierarchies. You can go through any workplace and determine who outranks who. It's much like a military type structure in that regard, right? A director is higher than a manager, and a manager is higher than a supervisor, and a vice president higher than a director. It's really a very formal structure in that regard. Plus, there's an informal structure, and there's informal power that comes to people for certain qualities they may have, or certain types of information or other things that they hold. And you need to adjust your approach and strategy, and really when you're interviewing people especially, if you understand the political motivations, the political influences that affect that person, you can adjust your fire just ever so slightly in that interview to get the information you really need to make your case, right? You also have to understand that at some point in your career, you will interview someone who outranks you, if you will, in the workplace by several steps. And in order to keep it respectful, you really have to think about that power hierarchy and ways to control that as well. So understanding who someone is in a workplace, where they sit, really is important to how you go about, especially in the interview phases and the presentation phases as well. So we'll jump into some of those powers, and let's just generally talk about power in the workplace in real general terms. So the first thing we need to think about is workplace power in and of itself is not a one-way thing. It's easy to think that the person that's the vice president or the plant manager or the CEO of an organization has all the power. But we know that's not true. If we look at a labor union, for instance, if the CEO says everybody's going to take a $2 an hour cut in pay, and the union says we're going on strike, there's no production, I would say the power has shifted, in that case, to the worker. And it's really not even, there's a lot of subtle differences where power can shift in that way. And so between a witness and a suspect, you might think that, well, if I'm being asked to be a witness, to interview and to implicate my boss in something, that power influence that he has over me or she has over me is the ultimate power. But could very well be that I know many things about this boss and I hold the power because I know many things about them that could get them into trouble. So it cuts both ways. Everybody has a certain amount of power. I like to think about the person who works in McDonald's and is working the register. On a busy Saturday afternoon, there's 3 people working and the place is just packed. I would like to think that the manager has power over that employee because they could reward them, or they could counsel them, or they could put them on fries on a hot afternoon, right? Which is probably the worst job in the world, as I recall. But the worker also has the power because they could just simply say, I'm going home now. And you have 2 workers for all of that crowd. So it cuts both ways. So in workplace power, don't just think about the hierarchy from the top to the bottom, but also think about bottom to top. That will help you frame your interviews as you go forward. Let's take a clearer look, really a side-by-side look at the tale of 2 power holders. On the left, we have the boss, right? They hold a position that can make work life hard for any employee, right? I mean, you all have had a job, I'm assuming, someplace and probably hold one today. And if your boss says, I'm going to put you on the midnight to 4 a.m. shift, you're going to get 4 hours of work a day, and that's when you're going to work, that for most people is not a pleasant thing. Most people don't like to work in the middle of the night. Some do, but most don't. But your boss can do that. They make the schedule. They can make things unpleasant for you with tasks too, okay? During that 4-hour shift, you're responsible for cleaning the restrooms. Your job may not be a housekeeper or a janitorial worker. Could be that you're a cashier somewhere. You're the night clerk at a hotel, but the boss says, you know what, I want those restrooms to be sparkling, and this is the best time, so I want you to do that. They could assign you unpleasant work. And they certainly have influence over the reward system. I mean, when it's raise time, they can say, you know what, I don't think Brian's doing very well. I'll give him a nickel an hour when everybody else is going to get 50 cents. So there's a clear power structure that the boss holds. But on the other side, the worker bee, as we call them, right, has control over the initial quality of those assigned tasks. So the boss says, you know, I want you to work that night shift, and I want you to clean the restrooms. And in the morning, our health inspector's coming in, so they better sparkle. Well, I could do a terribly bad job on cleaning those restrooms. In fact, make them unhealthy if I felt like it. So I have full control over the initial quality. Now I'm going to get in trouble for it, and the power shifts back. But make no mistake, I have the power to make things difficult and embarrassing for the boss, and every employee holds that power, right? It's likely that I have expertise that the boss doesn't have. So now the boss comes in at 6 a.m. and looks at those restrooms, and they're a mess, and I really just totally botched the job on purpose because I have that level of control. And he takes his control and he fires me. But he doesn't know where the cleaning materials are kept, because not all bosses do. I have people that work for me that do a fantastic job, and I have no idea how they do some of the things they do. I don't need to. The boss doesn't need to know how to do every job. They trust the people that they hire to do the jobs, and they don't need to know all the little nuances of doing it. So the worker bee has that expertise and that information that the boss doesn't always have. The other thing is that checked into the hotel that night before could have been this health inspector that's coming in, and I may have made a favorable impression when I engaged them in conversation, poured them a cup of coffee, talked to them for a while, and the boss may not know about connections that I have. So the quality control over initial tasks, the expertise that I hold as a worker, and perhaps some connections that I have made along the way are power influencers that I hold that my boss does not. So there's a balance of the power there. Certainly it shifts more to the boss because they have more immediate recourse, right? They could fire you, they could cut your pay, they can change the schedule. But make no mistake, the worker holds that power too. And when you start to think about the workplace power, you want to know where everybody's power comes from. So why is this important for the investigator? Because those power influences may impact the quality of an interview. Think about an interview where I'm being called in and asked if my boss did something wrong, right? My boss was accused of stealing, and I may have some information. However, the boss has on his desk my promotion, which is going to get me a 25% increase in pay, get me better hours, and put me on the management track. I think that most people would feel some pressure to downgrade the boss's involvement in the theft during that interview because of that reward power, and we'll talk about reward power in a minute, the type of power that the boss holds over them. It may also impact the initial complaint. So, Mr. Pine said that machine had been broken into and, somebody rifled through there. But Mr. Pine did not say anything about the fact that the machine door was not, this is from our midterm, the machine door was not damaged in any way, which kind of indicates somebody had a key. The initial complaint, he really didn't go into that. And sometimes in the initial complaint, we have an idea who may have done it, but we don't want to implicate that person because of some power reason, right? Power influences can almost make some interviews impossible. If you ever get the chance, the pleasure of interviewing a vice president of marketing, they tend to get a great deal of autonomy in a company. They are almost impossible to interview for wrongdoing. They really want to challenge you on every step of the way. And so, having a very high degree of power in an organization, and that's direct, legitimate power, can make your interview almost impossible, and sometimes you may have to forego it. And then your own power structure may influence or attempt to influence an investigation. Your own boss may call you and say, I want you to take this investigation, but hey, I know this guy, and let's just kind of make this thing go away. That is certainly a power influence directly over the investigator. So power influences matter. They truly matter to the investigator, and we need to understand what sources they come from now so that we can start to form a strategy of how to navigate around them as best we can when we can. So one of the most obvious ones would be a coercive power. And that's a position to punish others. You have coercive power over somebody when you can punish them. Okay? People fear the consequences of not doing what's been asked of them, so they don't do it, or they do it because they fear the consequence. This is very common in a military setting, right? If you don't, in basic training, make your bed properly, it's liable to be flipped upside down on the floor, and you're going to do some unpleasant duty to make up for the transgression you had in not making that bunk the right way, right? Pure superior-subordinate relationships involve coercive power generally. Could a suspect that you're going to, that you have in your sights, have coercive power over another witness? Right? I don't want to say anything bad about Dr. Wisniewski because, he has the power to give me a bad grade. That is coercive power. There's no question about it. I try not to exercise it as an instructor, but it is there, and people worry about such things. And could the complainant be coerced, right? Bringing in a complaint, but not bringing forward the entire complaint. And we see this happen a lot. People will bring forward a complaint, and then when you start to do the investigation, you bring them back and you say, but you didn't tell me about this and this. Well, I didn't really feel the need to bring it up, and it's my boss, and I didn't want to put myself in the trick box, right? So there is a coercive power that is inherent in every organization, and it is probably the one that's most impactful, quite frankly. Maybe this and legitimate power, which we'll talk about, are most impactful, but when you know someone has coercive power, you have to make adjustments. We'll talk about adjustments in a sec too. So let's go through the rest of these power sources, right? Connection power. It's based on who you know, right? Family, friends, old bosses are definitely one in the workplace that you have to be concerned about as an investigator. A witness might feel protected, right? I don't have to be fully disclosure because don't worry, Brian's going to get me out of it, and he outranks this investigator. They may know your boss, or they may be, they may have connections with somebody several stories up, if you will, in the organization. I had a person one time who I interviewed, and I didn't realize he had a direct connection to somebody 4 steps above me in the food chain at the time. And that's considerable in an organization. And as soon as my interview was done, he went and complained that I was unfair to him in an interview. I got called in, had to explain myself. That connection power was something that he felt he could use to try to thwart my investigation, right? There could also be a family connection that you just don't know about, or a romantic connection. I have seen that happen more than once. You call somebody in as a witness to something and they saw nothing. They have no information for you. Sorry, I can't help you. Well, come to find out your suspect is their sometime boyfriend. And they don't want their all-time wife to find out, or husband to find out about that, right? So you have to think about those connections. That connection power could certainly influence your investigation. Now, expert power is really interesting in the workplace because sometimes it comes down to what you know, not who you know. So, the expert power comes from a person's expertise. It doesn't have to be a specialized worker. In the case of that hotel, right, where I'm the desk clerk and I had to clean the bathrooms, I just happened to be the only one on the shift that knew where the cleaning materials were, right? So sometimes the expertise protects people, okay? A witness might not want to talk to you about someone if that person has specialized expertise that, if gone, would make their life harder, okay? So, for instance, 2 coworkers, and one of them knows how to work the big machine and the other one doesn't, okay? If indeed one who knows how to work the big machine gets fired, the other one's job kind of goes away because there's no production coming off the big machine. They can't do, say, the quality control for that product. So they're protecting themselves because they need to protect that person with the expertise. And sometimes that hurts your ability to verify and validate things in your investigation. You're asking questions about somebody who has such expertise that their boss doesn't want to say anything bad about them. I can't lose Bob. Bob does everything around here. He's the one guy that holds the whole thing together. Even though I'm Bob's boss, I know without Bob, I'm sunk. I am certainly not going to help you investigate Bob if Bob is the subject of the investigation and may get terminated. So expert power is something that Bob holds in that case. And understanding if someone is indeed that linchpin in the organization, when you go to interview them, may give you some pause as to how you ask questions. So informational power is an interesting one because basically you get your power from knowing something potentially about someone else, right? Data custodians. If I know that Brian comes into work late every day because I'm the data custodian of the access control system, I can see that Brian comes in at 9 o'clock every day and he leaves at 3 in the afternoon, right? I have informational power over Brian because Brian's cheating the company on time and I know it. Now, I could use that two ways. If Brian gets jammed up for cheating on time and gets called in and I get called as witness, I have two options here. I can tell people the truth, or I can say, I've got this leverage over Brian. Maybe I can use it against him and say, okay, what's in it for me? And so when you have information, the whole idea information is power. I hate that term because it's only power if you share it, quite frankly. But if you have information over someone, because of your legitimate job, you may use that. And it may also be, quite frankly, someone who has legitimate information over the investigator or someone in the investigator's chain, which is why a corporate security investigator has to make sure they stay immaculately clean in everything they do, right? You can't leave work early and have somebody punch you out. You can't do those kinds of things if you're a corporate investigator, because that gives somebody potentially informational power, and they could use that against you in the investigative process someday. Legitimate or positional power is the power that we all really associate with the workplace. It's based on the position you hold. Think about the CEO, the CFO, the vice presidents, people in the C-suite, as they call them, right? Could a witness simply say, I don't have time for this. I'm not coming in. I have too high a position in the company and I can't participate in this, so you're on your own. Could they blow off your investigation? Or could they come in and say, I don't know anything about anything, just I got things to do, right? That busy person, right? And there might be a reluctance to investigate in the first place. And I have seen this happen personally more than once and been able to talk people back from that ledge of almost making bad decisions when they said, yeah, but you know what? This he's pretty high up and he's tight with the CEO. If this were anybody else, we'd go through with this case, but I think we just leave this one alone. I hate those. I absolutely hate those, but you'll get them where someone says, okay, we normally have enough, but because of this person's position, we're going to need more. Just let this go. And that will happen. And that legitimate power keeps that person from being investigated in the first place. Legitimate power is the easiest one to see because you can see it on an organizational chart. You can see who outranks who. In the college, you are outranked by your instructors, who are outranked by their department chair, who's outranked by the dean and the provost and the president, right? There's a definite hierarchy there. And any one of those people could use their legitimate power to try to obstruct investigation over one or the other, or to institute an investigation over one or the other. Now, thank goodness in the environment we're in, I have never seen that in Slippery Rock. I wouldn't be privy to it, but I've not really seen that. It doesn't seem the place that goes on. But in most workplaces, at some point, it will. So you have to understand the legitimate power and lay out your org chart before you get started so you understand who works for who and who has power over who in legitimate positional power realm. Referent power. So this is the person who's just well liked and respected in the workplace. The cool kids, right? A lot of times this comes from longevity. So you have someone who's been in that department for 30 years, 35 years. They tend to become a folk hero to some people, right? This guy's been around forever. He comes in every day. Everybody likes him, okay? And when you interview people, they will leave out things about that person. You say, okay, well, who in your department may have had access to that particular room where the missing item was? And they will go through the list of people and they just won't mention that person who has been around forever. And you say, well, what about Jim? Well, yeah, but Jim, come on. I didn't bring him up because everybody knows Jim didn't do that. He's been around forever, right? They become a bit of a hero, and people don't want to talk about people like that in terms of wrongdoing. And unfortunately, the odds are just the same, although, there is some history to show that the person has behaved over a long period of time. I have had people with extreme amounts of tenure at a company go bad really quick for one reason or another, right? They could have a gambling problem. They could have healthcare issues where they need more money and they start to embezzle very late in their career. It does happen. But people don't want to talk about those folk heroes, those people who've been around forever that are really just, the most revered in an organization. And you need to understand who those people are and always bring them up in the conversation, quite frankly, just in case anybody forgot to mention them. But we'll go through again some of these things you can do with each one of these types of power. But referent power is really powerful in an organization. Some people just become untouchable because they've been there forever and everybody likes them and everybody respects them, so they could never have done anything wrong. And finally, we have reward power. Pretty basic, right? I have power because I can give you a reward. I can give you a raise. I'm your boss and I can give you a raise. Or I'm part of a promotional committee, a tenure committee at a university. I have some reward power. I have something that you want and I can make that happen. And let's just say it's a financial hardship. It is money. I'm able to hand out bonuses to people. It's one of the perks of my job is that I have a certain amount of budget where I can hand out bonuses to people as, they do certain things, right? I have a fund for that. If someone has a financial hardship and they get called in to be a witness against me and they know that I hold the bonus money, they're going to be less likely to call attention to the fact that I may have done something wrong, right? I hold reward power. I can help them fix their problem. And sometimes it even goes to the point where the witness perceives some reward for either cooperating or not cooperating with the investigation. So, if I cooperate with this investigator, then he's probably not going to, accuse me of the things I've been doing, right? Because your witness may be guilty of something totally unrelated to your case, right? Had that happen more than once where somebody comes in and you find out that they were up to something and it came out as part of you're doing a theft investigation and you find out that one of the people you interviewed is not a thief but a sexual harasser, right? Those things come out in those conversations. And the person you're interviewing may think to themselves, well, if I cooperate with this guy and I get on his good side and I tell him what he wants to hear, then he's probably not going to jack me up for the sexual harassment stuff that's eventually going to get found out. So reward power is a two-way kind of a thing. It is the witness who may feel that there is a reason to protect someone who can give them a reward, or they may feel that cooperating in an investigation will yield some kind of reward or keep them out of harm's way for some transgression they may have had in the past. So now we've talked about all these different influences that can make a witness not tell you the truth, make a subject not want to talk to you at all. By a subject, I mean the person who you really have your sights on, right, for this particular transgression or this wrongdoing, right? A suspect may not want to talk to you, but it may not be for the reasons that you think. It may not be because they did the thing wrong. It could be that there's just some coercive power out there or some reward power that they expect. And so you've got to understand that power dynamic in your investigation and how it might impact your outcome before you start the interviews. Understanding relationships between witnesses, suspects, subjects, okay? You need to understand before you start the interview. You need to do a little connection chart, if you will, to understand how people interact, whether it might be a personal interaction, professional interaction, whether there's a direct reporting relationship, whether there could have been a past relationship either through one being the other one's boss or perhaps a past romantic. I have interviewed people in cases before where it never came out until late in the case that two of my witnesses were at one time married. And there was certainly some reward or coercion going on because one was paying the other one child support, and they were concerned that if they were too rough on the payer, that they would lose their job and the child support would stop. There was definitely a reward power dynamic going on there, right? And you need to research and ask those questions. Then we use the power dynamic in some cases to our advantage and weigh our information against that power dynamic so we know what is really valid and what may have been influenced. So let's go through some examples of each one of those and some tactics you might be able to use when you come across these power dynamics when you do your analysis. So when there could be coercive power, you really need to understand the organizational chart, right? Where that coercive power may come from, whether it's, because of rank, right? A little bit more like legitimate. And some of these overlap, okay? So don't get too critical about understanding each one separately. Just understand the dynamics themselves. So in coercive power, family connections. A family member can coerce someone else into doing something. 22% of spouses meet at work. That's a true statistic. And so there is some power dynamic. And if 22% of spouses met, then let's think about the number of relationships that didn't quite make it to the altar, right? There are relationships between people at work, and sometimes those can be coercive if they go wrong, okay? Look at a witness's reviews and their personnel record, okay? So if they have, if you are able to go to your HR department and say, I'm going to interview Brian, may I take a look at his more recent personnel file and any struggles he may be having? And I find out in there that Brian has 3 letters of reprimand, all written by Bob, his boss, in the last 6 months. The last one says one more trouble and you're terminated. And then Brian's going to be called in to give witness against something that Bob may have done. I know that Brian is going to hold back. One of the ways you can combat that in all of these powers is when you interview somebody, start off with, are you concerned about being interviewed as part of this investigation? What are those concerns? Give them the opportunity to tell you, well, I don't want to get anybody into trouble. Is there anybody in particular that you don't want to get in trouble? I mean, are you feeling any pressure? Let them tell you that. They really will want to tell you that if you give them that opening. Otherwise, you'll never get it out. So one of the ways in coercive power situations where you suspect that might be, and even not, it's a pretty good practice to ask somebody if they are concerned about being interviewed as part of the investigation. Almost everybody will say, yes, I'm nervous. I don't want to get into trouble. To which you can come back, well, if you did nothing wrong, then you're certainly not going to be in trouble. We're just trying to get to the truth here, right? But ask them what their concerns are, and they might just tell you. Now, in connection power, it's really knowing who's who in the zoo. You've heard me say that before. Make your connections through some research. If you do a Google search of anyone, even those services you have to pay for will give you some basic information out of the chute. So if you look up my name, it will give you a list of people who may be connected to me, along with sometimes their maiden name. If they're female and they're married. Could be parents' name, which may be different than my own. But if you do those simple Google searches, we're talking about online information. You look up somebody at Facebook, you look them up in LinkedIn, you look them up on Instagram, and you look for hobbies. Because hobbies will tell you about clubs, and clubs will tell you about people they know. And former employers, when you look in LinkedIn, and then you look for similar former employers with other people you're going to interview. If I'm new to a company within the last 3 years, and I work for Bob, and Bob's been here for 2 years, you may find out that Bob and I worked for 20 years together at our previous jobs. Bob came over, and he needed somebody he could trust, and he and I are real tight, and so he brought me over. I owe Bob this job that I have, which is really great. It's better than the last one. You want to be able to make those connections so that you can understand the power dynamic, why people may be reluctant to talk about another person. And another way to do that, quite frankly, is to talk to HR and ask them to look up the beneficiaries and next of kin. You might be surprised that someone puts down a coworker as their next of kin. If they have no real family, single person, may put down as the next of kin someone who they've been in a long-term romantic relationship with. And it may not be evident to the people at work that that's the case. And beneficiaries normally are not disclosed. It's not something that people at HR talk about because it is personal, but they can disclose that to you if you ask, to try to make those connections, to make sure you know how people are connected so that you, again, can ask the questions during the interview. Okay, we're talking about me and Bob, right? Brian, what do you think about Bob? Well, you've known Bob for a long time. I mean, you've only worked for him for 3 years here, but you worked for him 20 years someplace else. I mean, what did Bob do at the last job? Get in that conversation. Let the person in the interview know that you know that connection at some point so they can feel more comfortable talking about that connection, understanding that you've done your homework. Expert and informational power sometimes go hand in hand. What happens if the accused is terminated and they're the only ones who know how to run the spatulator? Yes, I made that up. There's no such thing as a spatulator. But what if they're the only one that knows how to do that? Do you not think that when I talk to their direct supervisor, whose annual review is based on how much output the spatulator has, right, per shift, right? It's one of the metrics that he's being judged on. Now we're going to lose the only guy who knows how to run that machine. Do you think he's going to be forthcoming with you? Okay. When you understand that work group unique skills are things that people can use to your advantage, then the best thing for you to understand is how that workplace actually works, how that work unit gets their job done, right? Talk to a member of the team that's really not involved in the matter, right? If you have a work group and something happened in the spatulation department, right? And you know that your list of suspects are people who could get into that particular area. So, you're investigating one of 10 people who can get in there. But if you have no reason at all to believe, and you can exonerate one of them because they weren't, there the day that something came up missing, call them in and interview them anyway. Get the lay of the land. Understand the relationships, especially, who is most important to the operation and what information they may hold that makes them someone who would be less likely to be implicated by people, not because they didn't do it, not because they didn't steal the thing, but because if we lose that person, our whole work unit's going to suffer. So we hold back on that information. So one of the things you can do, look for unique job titles, right? Spatulation operator versus floor operator. Why is this person's job title different? Oh, because they only worked at one machine. It's very important. We can't lose that guy, right? If you understand that and then talk to people about who those important key players are, you may find that that's a reason people don't want to tell you everything about that person, what they may have done, because they're being protectionist with their own livelihood. So expect some protection for those who have informational and expert power, right? If they have information that they just haven't shared with anybody, or if they have information over somebody, they will be protected. And you need to talk to someone who's uninvolved but part of that work group if you can, to get the lay of the land. That's the best way to make allowances for that type of power. Legitimate power, as you can imagine, goes kind of hand in hand with coercive power, because you are given the power legitimately to direct the work and the actions of others. Understand in that workplace whether or not this boss has a vindictive streak. That's one way to understand how powerful that legitimate power is. In some work groups, there's legitimate power. One person's the manager and everybody else is a worker bee, let's say. But everybody kind of gets along, and you just go to the manager when you need things like, I need a day off, or, I need to talk to you about the schedule. But it's not like they are constantly on you, right? We've all worked for those bosses before. You need to understand whether working for that boss, that person with legitimate power over one of your witnesses, when you cross them, is it like, as they say, death by paper cut? Slow but sure death, right? Cross the boss, he will make your life hell forever, right? Is that leader seen as weak or strong by people? Okay. Think about a sports team full of superstars. If everybody's a superstar, and you got a lot of concentrated talent, does that change the whole legitimate power structure? It kind of does. In fact, we see people like that in sports teams sometimes go bad, right? They do really dumb things. They get arrested because they're so good at what they do. They forget about the legitimate power, right? They don't worry about the owner of the team taking away anything from them, even though the person can. Now, how many pro football players have we seen that have gotten themselves really jammed up? I think Ray Lewis is one of the prime examples of that with, he was battering his wife, right? And then he was a pariah. No one wanted to touch him on a team. He lost millions of dollars, right? He didn't worry about the legitimate power. You need to understand how much legitimate power is exerted over your witnesses and how much that may influence their interview with you. If there's an extreme amount of legitimate power and they are extremely concerned that that boss is a strong leader who will come back to get them, you need to know that. If that leader is weak and there is no concern for it, you kind of need to know that too, because sometimes people will just undercut that boss for fun and sport, right? In an interview, you don't worry about him. He's a terrible leader. I just had an interview just recently where I asked about the person's boss. They said he's not a boss. He's seldom there. They just basically toss the guy aside. That influences the interview as well, where the person was frankly disrespectful to their boss. So legitimate power, understand how much legitimate power it's there. How much is it exercised? To what extent is it exercised? So that you can understand whether or not your witness may be holding back normally because they are concerned about the legitimate power that's held over them. Referent power is one of the toughest really to navigate, in my opinion, because, we talked about Bob, right? I need to come up with some new names so we don't confuse these people. Nobody's going to throw Bob under the bus. He's been around forever, but everybody loves Bob. Bob's the guy who remembers everybody's birthday and brings cake from home. And Bob and his wife always send you the cute Christmas card. And Bob's just been around he's the sweetest person, right? Could never do anything wrong. When you talk to witnesses, especially that one that may be detached from your case that you're getting info from and getting a lay of the land, talk about informal leaders. In this case, Bob would be considered an informal leader. He may not have the legitimate power, but everybody just, is so revering to Bob that indeed he is a leader of sorts in an organization. And he becomes untouchable. Especially informal leaders are more untouchable than legitimate ones in many cases because they have earned that respect through some action, be it tenure or actions or the way they treat people. But also consider Bob's been around forever. And when you talk to a witness, there may be that one witness who is the heir apparent to Bob's job. As soon as Bob retires, they're going to get the new job. They're going to get Bob's old job. They can't wait to see Bob go down. So you really need to understand who are the informal leaders, who are those people who are revered in the organization that people will be less likely to talk about, right, and give you information on. And also consider who that person or persons may be that would benefit if that revered leader just happened to step aside, go somewhere else. Understanding the motivations of those witnesses against or for a revered person in the organization, very helpful for validating whether or not that witness is being totally truthful with you about that person. And finally, reward power is a big one, right? Because everybody goes to work. There's one reason we go to work. We may love our job, we may enjoy what we do, but make no mistake, I get paid very well for what I do, but if my paycheck stopped, I probably would not be as happy at work and I probably would not be there. We always say, I really enjoy my work and I really enjoy it every 2 weeks even more, right, when the paycheck comes. Understand the reward power and how it's used in the organization of witnesses you're going to talk with. Generally speaking, when you have an internal investigation, by the way, you're dealing with a single work group or maybe two work groups. Very seldom do you have something that spreads across an entire set of work groups. You really start to hone in on with your evidence, your artifacts and things and say, okay, it's this work group right here. Somebody in this group, this connected group did something, right? And if you can talk to HR about raise patterns in that group, okay, who's gotten, there's sometimes an imbalance. Somebody gets more raises than somebody else. Raise season is something in big companies, right? Are there any rewards pending? So in my particular company, everybody gets a raise review in February. That is, if you're going to get a raise, that is when you get one. There are some during the year for extraordinary circumstances, but for the most part, February is raise season. So you're going to get your raise in February. If I have to interview people in January, what a pain that is, because they're concerned if they throw their boss under the bus and then they were wrong and they're not going to get a raise, right? That reward power is very strong certain times of the year, and it's stronger for people especially who are hoping to get a sizable raise, right? So one of the ways you can guard against the reward power being used against your witnesses is to call more witnesses. So let's just say you have narrowed down your list of people that you need to talk to 3. And there are 10 people in that work group. I would suggest you call 7 or 8 of them. Call in 4 people who you are pretty sure have absolutely no information to help you in your investigation. And in your investigation report, Mr. X had no information related to the matter. Mr. X was interviewed on such and such a date and had no information related to the matter. Why? Because the person with reward power then has no idea which person it was. The more interviews you do, the more people, because they will know who got interviewed, as much as you say, keep it confidential, especially if they have reward power, then they're likely to be the legitimate boss, and you will need to go to them and say, I need to talk to your people. I'm going to bring them in one at a time. But if you only bring in 1 or 2 people, then that person with reward power is probably going to guess who dimed them out, right? Who threw them under the bus. If you bring in everybody, then it gets harder. And you want to make it harder. You don't want people to suffer for being honest. And you can share that with your witnesses. They say, well, you called me in here first, so he's going to know that I'm the guy who threw him under the bus. No, because I'm going to call in everybody. and take the time to call in everybody, even though when you know half of them are a waste of time. Just put it in your report. They had no information. It's okay to do that. And in fact, it's preferred to do that when you think your witnesses will be more comfortable knowing that everybody was interviewed. I did a investigation at a site about 3 years ago in which the level of misbehavior rose to well beyond 7 figures. And I only needed to interview 2 people to get the story. I had enough artifacts that I needed to interview 2 people and then interview the subject, the person who I believed and eventually proved committed the wrongdoing. But I must have talked to 20 witnesses because I needed to throw those curveballs out there. I didn't need, if my case fell through, this person was going to stay on the job. And the people that I interviewed, the ones, if I only had a short list, were probably not going to be there long, or their rewards were going to be hit. So confidentiality is key. I can't tell you what anybody said. And the more people I talk to, the less likely you are to know who it was that threw you under the bus, especially if your behavior is well known as bad, right? It only takes one for really to give you the leads you need to go follow the trail to get the guy. So one of the ways to look at this is just talk to more people. And even if they don't tell you anything, only your report will say that. It will throw people off the scent. So why all this talk about power in the workplace, and what does it really have to do with investigations? It has a lot to do with investigations. It has a significant impact on how valid your interviews will be. And if you don't understand the power that someone else may hold over your witness, then you really don't have a good grip on whether that witness was totally forthcoming and honest with you. Okay? You can, with proper research, look at your witnesses, understand who they work for, what motivates them, be it reward or other factors, what connections they may have, right? All those things that may have them holding back on information, understand those up front so you can tailor questions such that you can get around those things, right? I understand that you and Melissa may have had a romantic relationship in the past, and then that's over, and those things happen. But what can you tell me about her on the job? Putting that whole relationship thing aside, what can you tell me about Melissa on the job, and her possible involvement in this, this event that we're investigating? It puts the person on notice that you already taken that into account. It makes them more comfortable. There could be more than one power dynamic in play, and normally there is in the organization and with a single player, right? Legitimate power. They're worried about, they're not going to throw the manager on the bus because he's the manager. And it's because he has maybe coercive powers. He can make them do bad things, or because of reward power, right? They all link together. And so you may have more than one power dynamic for a particular witness. You need to do an evaluation when you make your witness list of how they fit with other people that you're going to talk to so you understand those relationships and take them into account. Okay? You can't play into the power and politics, which means you need to stay squeaky clean. But you have to consider them and form tactics to tamper those down so that they don't influence your investigation. As we go through over the next couple of weeks, we start to talk about the interview process. We're going to talk about the process itself and the staging of the interview, which is hugely important. Then we're going to get into interviewing techniques. We're not going to be able to do a lot of them, although I am going to extend into the next week when we start talking about tools. We'll kind of mash that all together so we can spend enough time on interviews because they are a very important part of your investigation once you've collected artifacts from other systems and things like that. So, as we start to do interviews, and as we start to talk about interviews, I want you to think of people that you would interview in our simulated investigations and the power dynamics that could be there, and how you would play that, how you would make allowances, how some of your questions might consider those power struggles, if you will, and dynamics so that people will be forthcoming with you. I love it when a plan comes together because I say we're going to be 45 minutes, and here we are at 44:12. So this week you have some reading to do. It's an academic article on power dynamics in the workplace. I just think it's a nice cap to what we talked about here. Please read it and put it in the context of your own workplace, places you worked before. Think about it, putting a name with each type of these powers, right? Who would be the person that you would think of when you think of this type of power and potential abuse of it? The lecture, you're done. Thank you. We're done here. There's a quiz. It's due Sunday, 11:59 p.m. Please do not be late because from here on out, I can't accept any late work. So if you miss the deadline for something and you have not talked to me ahead of time, then it would be very rare for me to say, go ahead and do it. Just, I forgot, isn't going to work anymore. I'm going to be looking for doctor's excuses and those kinds of things if you would tell me that there's a problem, because we're kind of getting late in the game here. By the time the semester's over, I need to have everything graded and ready to go. So please, no late work. Sunday at 11:59 for the quiz. With that, have a great week. Contact me if you need me. Everybody has my text and email information and office hours, but certainly I'm willing to talk to you outside of office hours all the time. Have a great week.